I'm Bonnie Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social issues from diverse perspectives. This week, we're speaking with woman thought leader, Dr. Paula Stone Williams. She's a transgender author, public speaker, and pastoral counselor, and has a new book, As a Woman. She writes about her experiences before and after transitioning and what she learned about being a woman. Welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm fine. It's good to be with you today.
Thank you so much for being here. So you write in the book about the fact that I don't think it's really generally known by the American public that evangelicals, and you were of course a very powerful evangelical pastor before you transitioned, that they don't talk about gender or sex or anything LGBTQ related, so they don't really know anything about it. Is that right?
Well, I don't think that's actually correct. I think they would be pretty convinced they know what they need to know about it. And they have a particular perspective on what the Christian scriptures teach about the LGBTQ plus population. And it is not particularly positive toward our population. And this would not just be true of fundamentalist Christianity, it would be true of the fundamentalist forms of all the desert religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. All three of the desert religions, the Abrahamic religions and their fundamentalist forms, tend to be fairly restrictive. It's also important to note that in their more generous forms, all three are very supportive of the LGBTQ plus population. For instance, the Jewish population in the United States is 83% supportive of marriage equality and transgender rights. It's also, I think, important to note that 52% of Christians in America are supportive of transgender rights. It's just that the other 48% are the ones who are getting most of the headlines nowadays.
What was it like for you preaching to very large crowds of parishioners? You spoke at very large mega churches. What were you thinking when you were attacking LGBTQ people when you spoke to large audiences, and yet somewhere in you had this feeling that you had always wanted to be a girl and then a woman?
Well, I knew from the time I was about 4 years of age I was transgender, but I think it's important to note not once ever in my public speaking did I say anything negative toward the LGBTQ plus population, not once ever. Unfortunately, I also was not supportive of them. I knew probably just a few years out of seminary that I did not accept the typical evangelical teaching on the gay population or the transgender population. I knew that my own interpretation of Scripture and the interpretation of many other top-notch theologians on Scripture is that it's absolutely fine to be gay. It's absolutely fine to be trans, that these are not, in fact, issues in the Christian Scriptures. The problem is I didn't take a stand for that. I thought I could bring about change from within, and certainly within my denomination, which was about 7,000 churches. I had a lot of influence, a lot of power, and I thought, well, it'll take a while, but I can bring about change from within. That was dead wrong, because I did not realize at the time that by not taking a stand, I was in fact remaining quite comfortable. And that being comfortable is unfortunately something we humans choose to do. You know, we have this notion that humans care more about the truth than we care about belonging. And yet pretty much every sociologist, psychologist, anthropologist will tell us that that's just a notion we've held for the last 500 years or so, and it's not ever been true. We humans will almost always choose belonging over the truth. And I think I was guilty of that as well until I came to see the damage that it was doing. And of course, now I wish I could go back and undo all of that.
Tell me about the damage you think you did.
Well, I think the damage was in not speaking out publicly in support of the LGBTQ plus population, particularly since I already theologically had come to the point where I felt it was important to accept them. And I just thought that taking time and changing from within and doing that deliberately and more slowly was in fact acceptable. And now that I'm on the other side of that divide, I recognize it was not acceptable.
What were the conversations? You say you didn't talk about LGBTQ issues in your when you were speaking to church audiences. But what about your behind the scenes conversations with other high ranking members of the evangelical church? What were those conversations like?
Yeah, it was generally known within those churches that I was supportive of the LGBTQ plus population among the leaders of those churches, not all of them. But I was in a setting in which I was fairly comfortable. For instance, I was the CEO of one of the larger church planting organizations in the nation, an organization that started churches from scratch. And so I regularly would be holding retreats for our lead pastors of those new churches. And I would routinely talk about where I was theologically with that group. And then we would also talk about the difficulties of making that public, because I think all of us knew that we would lose a lot of our people. And sure enough, I'm now a part of a lot of post-evangelical churches that have come out as open and affirming. And sure enough, you lose a lot of people and a lot of money. And sometimes the churches don't survive. For the most part, though, once they get over their loss, the church thrives and does well. It's interesting, 36% of the evangelical population are not supportive of marriage equality, but 51% of evangelical millennials are supportive of marriage equality. So we know the dynamic is shifting, but it's just not shifting fast enough in that world.
I understand the motivation for staying within the church and interpreting scripture differently, which happens in all religions. We've done many stories in the past about women in the Catholic Church showing that the church, the parts of the Old Testament and New Testament that say that women are not equal to men, you can interpret them in many ways. But do you think you're going to be successful at moving the whole church to accept your version of what those scriptures mean?
Oh, I'm certainly not arrogant enough to believe that I have the capacity to change much of anything. But I know that because I was an evangelical leader, that I'm not someone who could just disappear into the night and go about my life and not speak into that world. Most of the speaking I do, and I speak all over the world, is not actually on transgender issues or on spirituality. It's on gender equity. And I have been doing that for 4 years, ever since my first TED Talk came out. And that's the major subject on which I speak. So generally, when religious stuff comes up, it comes up more in the Q&A time, not in the keynote time, because I'm not asked to speak that often on that subject. I certainly am not invited into evangelical Christian environments to talk about it, because that world has no interest in hearing from me.
You talk a lot about music in the book. Was music part of the therapy that kept you going when you decided to transition?
No, it was not. Listening to music, certainly, but singing was always important to me. I had my own band, my own vocal band. We made 4 albums back in the day when I was in my teens and 20s. We were called the Advocates. And I loved that music. And now singing's tricky because as a transgender person, anti-androgens and estrogen make tons of changes to your body. They don't make changes to your voice, to your vocal cords. So when I sing, it's still a male voice. And I resisted doing that for the first 6 or 7 years after transition. And the last year, I've started singing much more often. And it has been healing for me to be comfortable with the voice I have.
How have you changed in terms of being an evangelical Christian? How does transitioning?
I would not consider myself to be an evangelical Christian at this point. Okay. I have shifted away from a lot of those beliefs. We see there are a lot of post-evangelicals out there, and I would be among them. We see 3 major shifts taking place in Christianity today. I've studied religions for a long time. I used to teach a doctoral course, Current Trends in American Religion, in my previous life. And we're seeing 3 major shifts taking place. One shift is away from orthodoxy to orthopraxy, from believing the right things to loving well. And that's a major paradigm shift, the likes of which we haven't seen in 500 years. A second shift we see is the church existing not for its own self-protection, but existing for the common good. And a third shift we see is a shift away from seeing God as the eternal threatener who's eager to send everyone to hell, to God as the suffering participant who loves all of us as we are. Those are major shifts away from evangelical teaching. Evangelical teaching wants to separate itself from the world. It sees the world as a threat. It's focused very much on what you believe more than what you practice. Believing the right things is critically important in the evangelical world. And it also focuses very much on a theological concept called the substitutionary atonement, the belief that God has to send us to hell if we have ever made a mistake in our lives. And the only reason we wouldn't have to go to hell is that Jesus paid the penalty for us. And that's not something that I believe any longer, and nor would you see that taught in most post-evangelical churches. You see a lot of post-evangelical churches growing. I say post-evangelical because our methodologies, our church polity tends to be the same as evangelicals. But our theology is quite different. Our worship style tends to be the same, with great contemporary music and very interesting and practical teaching. It's the theology that has shifted.
Were you in the church when Donald Trump ran for president?
No, I was not. I was long out of it, and I would have been out of it by then, regardless. I know the point at which I would have left evangelicalism, even if I had not transitioned. My son was pastor of a large, rapidly growing church in Brooklyn, New York, and his church came out as open and affirming, and he was ostracized from the denomination as well. And so I would have been out, I think, before that. It's been alarming to me to look within evangelicalism and see how it has even become divided among itself. We see a lot of people coming into our post-evangelical churches. I'm a pastor of a church here in Boulder County, Colorado, that's post-evangelical. And we see lots of folks coming out of evangelical churches who just cannot take that more right-wing perspective on things.
Interesting. And yet it's the constituency, really, that elected former President Trump to office, right?
Well, it's really pretty fascinating. People will often say to me, gee, it's a shame that all the Republicans are opposed to transgender rights. And I say, well, I'd be careful about that, because 2 studies were done at the time of the 2020 election, and both of those studies indicated that 61% of Trump voters in one study, 61% of Republicans in the swing states in the other study are supportive of transgender rights. So if in fact 61% of Republicans are supportive of transgender rights, and I think it's fair to extrapolate out from those 2 studies that those numbers are probably right, then who is driving these anti-trans laws in the 30 states where they have been introduced? And yes, indeed, those are states controlled by Republican legislatures, but it's not Republicans driving it as much as it is evangelical Christians, 84% of whom believe gender is immutably determined at birth, 61% of whom believe we've already given too many civil rights to transgender people, and yet only 25% of whom know someone who's out as a transgender person. So it's quite clear right now that that is the segment of the American population driving these laws. I know it's fear-based when the day is done, and it is in fact something that will shift. The arts are always the first place you see change, anthropologically, sociologically, in culture. And religion is always the last place you see those changes occurring, particularly in the conservative forms of those religions. Or in the United States, it would be the fundamentalist forms of Christianity.
Tell me about male privilege and how you saw transitioning made you aware of things about male privilege that you didn't know until you transitioned to a woman. Tell me about that, please.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that I do not claim to have a cisgender female experience. I come from the liminal space between genders. I come from the borderlands. I'm a transgender woman. People will often ask me, do you feel 100% like a woman? And I say, well, I feel 100% like a transgender woman. Plus, I'm just me. I can't speak for anybody else in the transgender community. So I can only speak for myself. I say for myself, there's no way a well-educated white male in America can understand how much the culture is tilted in his favor. There's no way he can understand it because it's all he's ever known and all he ever will know. And I think there's no way for a woman to understand the full import of that, because being a woman is all she's ever known. I mean, she might have an inkling. She's working twice as hard for 81% as much, but I don't think most women have any idea. In the office across the hall, I know I was that guy. And I find my life far, far more difficult to navigate now than it was before.
How? Tell me. That's very.
Oh my goodness, probably more than anything else. If I could just go back and tell Paul things, the first thing I would say is, oh my God, just assume a woman knows what she's talking about and treat her accordingly. I mean, that alone would go a long way. I just get so tired of people assuming that I couldn't possibly be an expert in more than one area, or even an expert in one area. You know, I was brought onto the board of a nonprofit, and it's a large nonprofit. We have a large national conference. We hired a new CEO. We were talking about having her give a keynote for the conference. And I said, well, she's not a public speaker. It might be better if we just interview her. But if you would like her to speak, I would be more than happy to coach her. At which point a powerful white male in the room said, well, if we're going to do that, why don't we hire a real coach? I'm a speaker's ambassador for TED. I coach TEDx speakers. I've taught speech on 3 universities, 2 in the United States, 1 in Europe. Tell me what part of that does not make me a real coach? But of course, I didn't say anything, because I've discovered if you speak up as a woman, now you're just that woman. And I've also discovered, and this has been verified time and again, men will interrupt women twice as often as they interrupt other men. And so, you just stay silent, because that's what you learn to do as a woman. And you lose all the confidence that all those decades as a man gave you, because the world doesn't treat you as the expert that you are. I look at women who have this great confidence and coupled with the great humility, and I think, oh my goodness, how did they get there? Because I've lost more in 8 years as a woman than I think I gained in a lot of decades as a man. And, I know I will not live long enough to lose my male privilege. I mean, I know I've brought a lot of it with me when I transitioned, but to me, it is just so frustrating to not be accepted for that. I mean, I also wish I could go back and tell Paul the importance of deference. We teach women deference almost as a birthright, and men see deference as weakness. And I say to men, even when you're an ally, that's not deference, because you're still in control of being an ally. Deference is when you move from being an ally to being an assistant or an apprentice. When you say to the women in your world, you tell me what you need me to do next. That is deference. And I didn't learn deference. I wish I could go back and tell Paul the importance of really, truly, deeply listening. I'm a psychotherapist by trade. That's what my doctorate is in. And I know I'm a far better therapist now because I truly just listen now. I don't think it's my job to provide answers. The client has the answers within themselves. My job is just to help them remove the obstacles to finding their own answers. And I can't do that if I don't listen.
Oh, that's very interesting. Tell us about how your family reacted to, and ultimately, you still have a very loving family, 3 children, an ex-wife, etc.
Yeah, it was extremely difficult. I think that probably was one area that I greatly underestimated how devastating it was going to be, particularly to my wife and my son. My son and I have done a TED Talk together. We speak a lot together around the nation. He's written a beautiful book, She's My Dad, that talks about his struggle, because there aren't many books out there focused on the families of transgender people. But it's been difficult. I mean, it's shifted our relationship fundamentally. I mean, I exploded the family narrative, and you don't do that without consequences. I think for my girls, it's not been quite as difficult. They were there right away, very supportive, but both of them found their need to kind of take their leave later and deal with things. For Kathy, we remain close. We still work together, but it continues to be difficult for her. And it's hard. I remember when our marriage therapist was a brilliant man and retired. He was like 110. And we were his final clients on his final day, and we were both therapists. And I just asked him, Mike was his name. I said, Mike, how many couples are willing to work this hard? And he said, oh, maybe 1%. And I said, how many couples get this far? And he said, oh, yeah, again, probably 1%. He said, which is what makes this so tragic, because you're a lesbian and Kathy's not. And it was a 2-hour silent drive home, because we realized for both of us to be true to ourselves meant that we would no longer be married. And it was devastating. And it's really been hard for us. I never regret transitioning. I never think about transitioning back. I'm very comfortable in this body and the life I live now. But if I were ever going to regret it, it would be purely because of Kathy and Jonathan.
I'm curious, why
I
does she
still struggle.
why does she continue to work with you? Why doesn't she?
Well, you'd have to ask her that. Yeah, you would have to ask her that. You know, we're parents together, we're grandparents together. We were married for 40 years. We have a lot of deep respect and affection for each other. And so we continue to be good, close friends, as well as coworkers. We spend a lot of time with our 5 granddaughters. For them, my transition was nothing. I mean, it was 10 minutes. It was really easy for them.
Very quickly before we go, what do you think about these laws that several states are considering or have passed? The don't say gay laws is the quip that describes them, I suppose, but it does not allow teachers to talk about LGBTQ, to teach the children about what that means. And it's seen as very anti-gay, particularly to transgender children going through, I was born into body X, but I belong in body Y. How damaging is that, do you think? And how long will this persist?
Oh, it's horrendously damaging. There's no more at-risk people group in the United States than transgender women of color, transgender children. Transgender children have a suicide completion rate 13 times higher than their peers. So yes, this is terribly, terribly inappropriate. There was just a report today in either the Washington Post or the New York Times about the governor of Utah acknowledging that their attempts at passing anti-transgender legislation were focused on exactly 4 children in the state, one of whom is a transgender girl who is playing sports. So all of this tempest in a teapot is focused on that one adolescent child. These are solutions to problems that don't exist. The problems don't exist. And their solutions are costing children lives. And, we have a lot of people moving into Colorado from Texas because they cannot bear what's happening in Texas. Texas not only has all the anti-transgender orders that have been passed down from the governor with the support of the lieutenant governor, they also have 40 different laws pending in their legislature. It is just the creation of an enemy that doesn't exist. And it is the last gasp of a frightened segment of the population, creating the most inappropriate of enemies, the most vulnerable among us. It is truly tragic.
I read an article in the past week about that you're talking about it's a non-issue, or they're creating an issue around the non-entity, that it really is not a grassroots movement. It's all the activism around this is funded by the Koch Foundation, which is, we know, some of the richest arch conservatives in the country. And so they found an issue they think Republicans can campaign on in the upcoming midterm elections. Do you see it as a non-issue, or do you think it will be a winning issue for them?
It might win for them in the primaries. It's not going to win for them in the general election outside of extremely conservative segments of America. You can pretty much look at where evangelicalism is its most conservative and its strongest, and you can see that those are the parts of the 30 states, most all of them in the central and southern part of the nation. And in those segments, they might be able to win general elections. But this is an area in which the culture has moved on. LGBTQ plus issues are places the culture has moved on. And there's really not a leg to stand on biblically. Scripturally, they'll talk about 6 scriptures that are supposedly in opposition to having gay relationships or being in gay relationships. They can't point to a single scripture, not one, anywhere in the Old or New Testaments that speaks in any negative way about being transgender. So not only have they created a problem that doesn't exist, they've created a problem they cannot back up through their own scriptures. So it is a last gasp. But in the meantime, children are in great peril, and we cannot allow this to go unchallenged.
All right, that's an excellent place to end. It is a last gasp. We'll certainly be watching. It's a very controversial issue and affects so many people in this country. Thank you so much, Ms. Williams, for your time. That's all for this edition. Let's keep the conversation going on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.